Joined from our Durban studio by Charles Nyukonge. Charles is from the Center for Africa's International Relations at Wits University. Charles, it's a very good, thank you so much to have you along. Now, this, Charles, is for the very first time that we see a presidential election result being overturned or annulled right here on the African continent. What are your thoughts, particularly with regards yesterday's landmark ruling by the Supreme Court of Kenya?
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you to your listeners. First of all, may I correct that I'm no longer at the African Center for... I'm no longer at Wits University. Now I am at the African Center for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes, ACCORD, whose headquarters is based here in Durban, with regional offices across Africa. Yes, the decision of the judges in Kenya yesterday is a landmark decision, especially as far as electoral governance in the continent is concerned. But I think that if we focus so much on the decision, we're going to lose sight of an important factor, the maturing of African democracy, evidenced by the fact that as in 2013 and now 2017, the levels of violence which we have seen, or which we had previously seen in Kenya in 2017, have substantially decreased. Thus, we have seen through this decision that Kenya's democratic institutions, especially the IEBC and the Supreme Court, are actually working in tandem. And the Supreme Court, which is competent as per the 2010 Constitution to statute on matters of election contestations, has actually ruled. And suffice to say that all the parties have agreed to this ruling. And I think that this is some good news and celebration for Africa, because elections which we've been having this year, and perhaps in the last couple of years, and even the elections which are still before us, have been already recording certain political killings. They are recording a culture of intolerance where the contestants do not see the need to accept that they do not see the need to accept anything other than victory. And thirdly, the political culture in Africa by which when you lose everything is one of the reasons which actually create a lot of uncertainties around elections. So the judgment of the court on the one hand heightens that uncertainty, but I think at the same time we have to celebrate the maturing of the African judiciary, whose independence from the executive is manifest through this decision.
Mm-hmm. Now, Charles, as you say there, this may mean the deepening of Africa's democracy, but what does it mean, though, for the election observer missions? We had the African Union, the EU, the Carter Center from the United States, all of them giving this election a clean bill of health. And now we have this judgment from the Supreme Court. What then does this mean for the future of election observations, not just here in Africa, but I suppose globally?
Election observers missions are just there to observe what happens before the elections, on the day of the elections, and what happens after. And I think their decisions, and I maintain that their decisions or their statements are in tandem with what they observed. They observed that parties or candidates were allowed to campaign freely, which I'm sure that yourselves in the media, you also had that. They observed that elections went on very well or smoothly almost everywhere across the country, with a few exceptions, for instance, in Mombasa, which if you check the statement of the African Union, you would see that. And they also observed that the counting was done in tandem with the Constitution. Thus, for them, that process in itself was free and fair. Of course, what the courts are now ruling on is on the credibility of the process, and that is a technicality which the observers' missions do not really get into. The observers' missions are there to support the institutions so that they can run free and fair elections. And I think that we need to salute the observers' missions for the work which they have done, in part to support those institutions so that the confidence in the institutions is heightened and the violence is reduced.
And President Uhuru Kenyatta's reaction is really being scathing, branding the judges in one of the clips we played earlier as crooks and also promising to deal with them after the elections. Now, surely, Charles, it looks like we are heading for some serious period of tension in Kenya, particularly between the executive and the judiciary.
I beg to differ as far as that is concerned. I think that the first thing which Uhuru Kenyatta said is that he respects the ruling of the courts, which means that he respects the sacrosanct principle that the judiciary is independent. However, as a candidate, he has the right to express his dissatisfaction with the ruling, which is inconsistent with the other rulings. These elections were not about just the presidential elections. They were parliamentary elections. They were legislative elections. There were parliamentary elections, which are legislative elections. There were Senate elections. There were gubernatorial elections. All of those elections took place on the same day. Thus, it beats the imagination how, for instance, the courts could rule or allow the other results to stand and only contest those of the presidential. I would be curious to understand what the NASA party, led by the NASA coalition led by Raila, I would be curious to understand how they make of the fact that their senators, their parliamentarians have already been sworn in. Their governors in the counties and the states and the regions where they won have already been sworn in. But their only contestation is at the level where they themselves, the figureheads, they themselves, the brand power of the ticket have actually not been elected. I think that from that perspective, there is a case there and there is some inconsistency which perhaps the courts have to apply their minds to. And perhaps we should wait for the judgment or the full judgment of the courts in 21 days to actually dissect that, to see how they validate certain results and not the other results, of which all the results or all the elections took place on the same day.
And Charles, it looks like the next stage for serious contestation is also with the Electoral Commission, the IEBC, particularly with the two major candidates, Kenyatta and Odinga. And both men are bringing valid questions to the table. Odinga, on the one hand, saying he cannot accept a situation where he can run the next election with the same people running the Electoral Commission. And Kenyatta, on the other end, also arguing that, but really, if you replace the commission with just 60 days to go to an election, can you really guarantee a free, fair, and credible election?
I think I shouldn't be making a pronouncement on that. It's the IEBC has conducted elections. They are a constitutional body, and there are processes in Kenya, even in the electoral law, to actually raise those contestations. And if the court's ruling did not indicate that the IEBC should be dissolved, then I think that is a conversation which is taking place in the street. It's going to run its course, but if it has to go somewhere, then it has to cease from being Raila talking to the media about this, or Raila talking to the people about this, or Uhuru Kenyatta responding about this, or even the IEBC itself defending itself. But I think if you followed as well as I did, the chairperson of the IEBC has opened up and has said he welcomes the judgment of the court, and that the courts can actually run their independent investigations and prosecute whoever would have been party to the tampering of the results which the court alleges. The court the courts have not pronounced themselves to the effect that the IEBC should be dissolved, and that is only a wish for Mr. Odinga right now. And I think that if he wants that wish to sail through, he has to perhaps go to the same courts to demonstrate why he thinks that this IEBC would be incompetent to run the elections, which elections, by the way, have earned him some governor seats, have earned his party some parliamentary seats. So is it only a problem because that has not favored him as a person?
Now, Kenya has less than 60 days now to organize these new elections. Let's just quickly look at the logistics of those elections now. Firstly, the cost. Do you think, in your view, Kenya can now afford to have a second election and also organize the whole logistical program around such elections?
I think that really depends on the political will, but the Kenyans should expect that the budget is going to shift from some areas. Perhaps money would move from healthcare or from education to actually feed the electoral process, which in itself is an important process, considering that the stakes in the elections in Kenya are very high, especially with tensions which have been noticed and tensions which are currently right now on the streets ahead of the 60-day the elections which are supposed to take place in the next 2 months. So with Uhuru having said that he's happy with the rerun and even saying that he's sure that he's going to win, and I think we're going to see the executive cooperating and perhaps supporting the IEBC so that the elections can run. And I think as well that it's also the liaison place of the international community to support Kenya so that they can go through this transition, through this phase peacefully.
Mm-hmm. And really, what needs to be in place then, Charles, to ensure that come October, the country has what the world can really agree to be a fair and credible election?
I think three things. The first thing is there needs to be zero political killings, because the political killings actually heighten the tension and actually raise suspicion around the credibility of the institutions. That's the first. The second thing is the political parties or the contestants need to go to these elections perhaps with two minds. The one mind, I'm going to win, but the other mind, there is a real chance that I would lose. And work from that premise that I could lose, and actually convince not just the electorate that they love Kenya by the arguments that they are presenting once they win the elections, but that they love Kenya by the fact that they are going to accept a negative outcome of the elections. I think the moment that we do not have that, it's going to be difficult to see a situation where come October we are going to have peace and stability in Kenya very easily. The third element, which is very important, is the political culture by which the loser loses everything. People invest all their hearts, and this is perhaps Raila's last chance. So he's invested enormously in these elections. If it is not guaranteed in any way, form, or shape that a loss in the elections is not an entire loss, that he becomes still a key part of the construction of Kenya's developmental state, then we are going to find someone, for instance, who is going to be disgruntled. And this goes as well for Raila as it goes for Kenyatta. So these three things are very important so that Kenya can move forward.
Mm-hmm. And talking of your last point there, Charles, are you then suggesting maybe that it's time for electoral reform or a constitutional reform in the way that the elections are held, and that this winner-take-all format is discarded?
I think that there's something which we can learn from the United States, democratic system. A lot of those who were in the Obama administration are currently in different academic institutions, lending their experiences to those institutions, lending their experiences to young people who would want to govern in their country someday. And the example, for instance, you mentioned the Carter Center. The former Secretary of State, John Kerry, is actually in the Carter Center, and he was part of the delegation that was in Kenya. This is what seems to happen in the United States, where a party that loses has its brand heads or its foreigners join academic institutions, and that there is something for them, because when they join the academic institutions, they stay there, they share their experiences, and before long, once they come back, they reconstitute. Thus, it is not a system where once you lose, you are left in the cold, or you have to go back to the village and perhaps cry there. That's not the case right now in Africa, and certainly not the case right now in Kenya. If Raila has to lose these elections, Raila almost certainly has nothing to gain as far as the political system in Kenya or the way it is constituted right now is concerned. And this is really not something homogeneous to Kenya. It's something homogeneous, or perhaps to the African political system. And it's at that level that the continent needs to start having a conversation, that if we are going to have peaceful transitions, we have to look for ways in which we accommodate those people who emerge, for instance, with 45% of support, 49% of support. You can't just wish that support away by overnight just because you have carried the day with 51%.
And the conduct of elections in Kenya have always been a violent affair, but this previous election that has now been nullified was relatively peaceful when you compare to the 2007 poll that saw over 1,000 people being killed in post-election violence. Now, given these tensions that we are currently witnessing over the nullification of this particular result, is there, Charles, a real danger that the country can descend back into violence in October?
I think that right now there will be a lot of scrutiny on the system, and I think that the results will be uncontestably clear, and I do not really see any violence, so I'm optimistic that there will be no violence. Suffice to say that we had similar elections in 2013. There was no violence. The elections which saw the coming to power of Uhuru Kenyatta. This was his second term which he was seeking. Were it not for this decision of the court, those elections happened already on the 8th of August. We have already gone past the 3-week mark. We didn't see any violence. Yes, there were emotions here which are expected, that people were disappointed. That happens everywhere, especially in systems where elections are so hotly contested, and in systems where once you lose, you have lost everything. So I hope and I trust in the goodwill of the Kenyan people that these elections reaffirm the supremacy of the judicial system, reaffirm the independence of the judiciary and the separation of powers which is enshrined in their constitution. But more than anything, that the Kenyans are going to demonstrate to the world that, as their courts have done, that they too can also defy the odds of those who think that there will be violence in Kenya, and show us a way of a peaceful transition, if there's going to be one.
Charles, what can Africa, the African continent, what can we learn from Kenya's experience? What we can learn from Kenya's experience is that it is possible to transform a culture of political violence to a peaceful contestation around the ballot box. I think, as you mentioned, from 2007 through 2013 and now 2017, the levels of violence have actually substantially reduced. And I think that the labeling or the fear that countries which have previously been in violence, that they will always be in violence, should now really be a rhetoric of the past. The second thing which Africa should learn from this is the expedience with which the Supreme Court actually gave their ruling on this matter. In 2013, there was a bit of lagging when the contestations went to the Supreme Court. This time they were expedient, and their rulings have actually been accepted by all the parties. And I think that is actually something which Africa needs to salute, that yes, we have judiciaries which, in the face of political tensions, that they can actually rise above the waters and demonstrate that they are really independent. And I think that's something which, as well, the world should now start giving credit to African judicial institutions, if not African institutions in general. And finally, Charles, when you look into the future, after the end of October, after the elections have been held, do you see a similar result that we saw a few weeks ago, or do you think maybe Odinga this time around may emerge victorious? I would be surprised if the results change, because right now the parliament is already constituted. He does not have majority there. The governors have already been sworn in. He does not have a majority there. And these elections all took place on the same day. They were transmitted through the same system. So unless really something happens, I do not expect to see a change. But at the same time, maybe with the tides, the Kenyan people are allowed to still change their minds. Maybe those who did not vote are now going to go and vote, because some may not have had faith in the institutions, but now this reaffirms that the institutions are strong, the institutions are independent, and they have no reason to think that they would be, or their votes are going to be stolen. So it's really left in the hands of the Kenyan people, and I think we should actually applaud them and ask them to give us a clean slate
go back to the polls, vote, and when they vote, they should be of two minds. It can be victory, it can be defeat. However, whether it is victory or it is defeat, Kenya remains one, and Kenya remains part of Africa. We need Kenya for Africa's development.
And on that note, we have to thank you so much for your insights there. Charles Nyukonge from Accord, speaking to us live from our Durban studios.